On a warm July evening in 1988, in a 14th-floor penthouse apartment on the east side of Manhattan, a 23-year-old man named Carter Cooper stepped outside onto the balcony of his mother's home, reached his hand out toward her, and was gone. His mother, Gloria Vanderbilt, the great-great-great-granddaughter of the richest man in American history, was standing just a few feet away. She could not reach him in time. She has said that in the moments after she nearly followed him, Carter's younger brother Anderson was 21 years old. He was not there that evening. He would spend the next 4 decades carrying the weight of that moment, the grief, the questions that never fully resolved the shadow of a name that had already taken so much from everyone who carried it, and the growing quiet certainty that the only way to survive being a Vanderbilt was to stop being one. This is not the story that most people tell about the Vanderbilt family. Most people tell you about the money, the mansions, the parties, the spectacular collapse of a $3 billion fortune across 3 generations. That story is real, and it is extraordinary. But it is the surface of something deeper, something that nobody who has watched the Vanderbilt family from the outside has ever quite been willing to look at directly. Because underneath the railroads and the Newport cottages and the Gilded Age excess, there runs a current of damage so consistent, so precisely transmitted from one generation to the next, that it starts to look less like bad luck and more like inheritance of a different kind entirely. And the last person to receive that inheritance was a man who spent his entire career telling other people's stories, because for a very long time, telling his own was simply too much to bear. If you want to understand what it actually costs to carry one of the most famous names in American history, stay right here, because this story goes places that the history books do not. And if this is the kind of history that changes the way you see wealth and legacy and family, hit like and subscribe, because we have more where this came from. To understand what Anderson Cooper inherited, you have to go back much further than his own childhood. You have to go back to a 10-year-old girl sitting in a judge's chambers in Manhattan in 1934, answering questions about whether she wanted to live with her mother. The girl was Gloria Vanderbilt, the daughter of Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, great-grandson of the Commodore and a man who had managed to gamble and drink his way through most of a $15 million inheritance before his heart gave out at 42, leaving his teenage wife and their infant daughter with almost nothing except the Vanderbilt name and a trust fund the baby would not be able to touch for 21 years. Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, the mother, was beautiful, social, and entirely unprepared for the reality of raising a child alone. She traveled constantly, leaving little Gloria in the care of nurses and grandmothers, crossing the Atlantic as often as once a month, moving through a world of parties entitled Europeans, while her daughter waited somewhere behind her. By the time little Gloria was 8 years old, she had been quietly transferred into the care of her Aunt Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, a sculptor and the founder of what would become the Whitney Museum of American Art. The transfer was informal at first, and then in 1934 it became the subject of the most sensational custody trial in American history, a 60-day courtroom spectacle that the tabloids dubbed the trial of the century, packed with accusations of parental unfitness and social scandal that Americans living through the economic crisis of the 1930s, struggling on incomes of less than $2,000 a year, devoured with a kind of hungry fascination. The newspapers called little Gloria the poor little rich girl. She was 10 years old. She sat in a judge's chambers and said clearly and without apparent coaching that she never wanted to live with her mother. She said her mother had never been nice to her. Custody was awarded to the aunt. What the newspapers did not report, and what Gloria Vanderbilt would spend the rest of her long life trying to understand, was what it meant to be a child whose worth to the adults around her was almost entirely financial. The trust fund was what drove the custody battle. Not love, not genuine concern for her well-being, but the question of who controlled the money. Her mother had fought to keep her, partly because without the child, the allowance was reduced to almost nothing. Her aunt had taken her in with motives that were at best complicated. And after the trial, once the question of the money had been settled in court, Gertrude Whitney's interest in the girl she had fought so hard to keep faded considerably. Little Gloria was raised in a household that was stable, but not warm, with rules that were strict and affection that was carefully rationed. She later described feeling like someone who did not truly belong in every room she entered, and that feeling followed her across marriages and cities and decades, a wound that the Vanderbilt fortune had created and could not close. Gloria's response to that wound was creative and commercial in equal measure. When she finally came into her trust fund at 21, she did not simply live on it. She married and then married again, and then again, searching with each marriage for something the custody judgment had taken from her, the experience of being genuinely chosen by someone who had nothing to gain from the choice. In the 1970s, she found a vehicle for something she had not expected: business. She began putting her name and her swan logo on a line of designer jeans, and the timing was extraordinary. The designer denim market had barely existed before she entered it, and the combination of her name, her instinct for marketing, and a silhouette that was deliberately memorably fitted made the jeans a phenomenon. By 1979, her label was generating royalties on $125 million in annual sales. She said in an interview that year that the money she had made herself had a reality to her that inherited money never had. She had taken the most burdensome thing about herself, the name, the public identity, the label the newspapers had attached to her at 10 years old, and she had turned it into something she controlled entirely on her own terms. 4 marriages had followed the custody ruling. The first, at 17, to a much older man, was an echo of her own parents' imbalance. The second, to the conductor, Leopold Stokowski, who was 42 years her senior, produced 2 sons and a serious personal crisis from which she recovered slowly. The third, to the film director, Sidney Lumet, lasted 7 years. The fourth, to a writer named Wyatt Emery Cooper, was the one that held, and the one that gave her finally a family she could recognize as genuinely her own. They had 2 sons together. The older one was named Carter. The younger one was named Anderson, and he carried his mother's family name as his first name, a deliberate tribute to the Vanderbilt connection, while his last name came from his father's simpler Mississippi roots. Gloria gave him both identities in equal measure, as if she understood already that he would need the balance away into the world, and a way out of the one she had been born into. Anderson Cooper has said that the person he was before the age of 10 was someone he can barely remember, someone more open, more outgoing, more simply present than the person he became. What changed him was January 5, 1978, the day his father, Wyatt Cooper, went into surgery for a heart condition and did not come back out. Anderson was 10 years old. He stood in the hospital and received the news alongside his mother, and something shifted in him that he would not fully examine for another 4 decades. He did not cry, or barely did. He pushed the grief down into what he would later describe as a deep hole inside himself, and he covered it over carefully, and he went on. He became quieter. He became more watchful. In the years that followed, while other boys his age were simply growing up, Anderson was learning a different set of capabilities entirely: how to read a room for signs of distress, how to hold his own feelings at a distance so they would not interfere with his ability to function, how to be present and useful without being fully open. He became, in his own words, very concerned with survival, not his own particularly, but with the survival of his mother, with holding together the small family that remained, with being the person who stayed. Then came July 22, 1988. Anderson was 21. His brother Carter, who had attended Princeton and was working as a book editor at American Heritage, who was by every account, including Anderson's own generous testimony, more intelligent and more promising than the person now remembering him, had been going through a serious and difficult period in the months before. He had recently ended a relationship that had mattered to him. He had moved back into his mother's apartment. He had recently been prescribed a new medication for a respiratory condition, one that carried documented and serious known reactions, including agitation, extreme sleeplessness, and acute changes in emotional state. He had begun seeing a therapist, and by the accounts of everyone who knew him, there had been no clear signal, no warning that anyone had seen coming. Carter was not someone who had shown signs of crisis before. He was, by the descriptions of people who worked alongside him, someone who was thoughtful and careful and quietly serious. And on that July evening, he was gone. Gloria was there. She carried what she had witnessed for the rest of her life, and she would later write that the loss stripped her completely bare, that the only thing that kept her moving in the days that followed was the sheer continuous weight of the grief itself. Anderson has said that he thinks about Carter every single day, not always as the first thought in the morning, but there has not been a single day across more than 30 years when the thought did not arrive at some point. He has said that the particular cruelty of this kind of loss is that you spend the rest of your life searching for answers that never fully arrive. The medical findings that followed offered nothing definitive. Carter's therapist was genuinely surprised. There was no note, no clear warning that anyone had recognized in time. There was no satisfying explanation to hand the grief, and Anderson and Gloria would carry that absence between them for the rest of Gloria's long life. They talked about it publicly for the first time in 2011, sitting together on Anderson's television program, both of them speaking the word closure with the same tone of quiet but unmistakable contempt, as if it were the most insulting idea anyone had ever offered a grieving person. "There is no closure," Gloria said. "You never get over it. You learn to live with it." Anderson agreed, and watching his face as he agreed, you understood that the learning was still very much in progress. What Anderson Cooper did with all of this is one of the more remarkable things that the Vanderbilt story produces, because it is the opposite of what the family had done for the previous 100 years. Every Vanderbilt before him, faced with the anxiety of the name and the weight of the expectation, had built outward. They had constructed mansions and thrown parties and married European titles and accumulated properties and tried to translate the money into something that looked like permanence and meaning. They had gone bigger, always bigger, as if scale could substitute for substance. Anderson Cooper went the other direction entirely. He went to Yale, graduated, and then, rather than trading on the family connection or using the weight of the name to open doors in established media, he bought a home camera, taught himself basic filming technique, and traveled to Southeast Asia to document conflict on his own, with no network, affiliation, no assignment, and no institutional support of any kind. The footage he brought back was raw, and sometimes technically imperfect, but it was real in a way that opened doors that the Vanderbilt name, for all its weight, never could have opened for him, because those doors required something the name could not supply, which was credibility earned entirely in the field. He went on to cover situations of profound and shared loss in Myanmar, Somalia, Rwanda, Bosnia, places where hardship was not a private matter, but a condition shared by everyone around him. And there is something in that specific choice, the deliberate immersion in other people's survival and grief, that starts to look less like professional ambition and more like the search of a person trying to understand something about endurance that his own life had not yet taught him clearly enough. The rejection of the Vanderbilt identity was neither accidental nor passive. Anderson Cooper has articulated it in terms that are striking for their precision and their honesty. He said that from the time he was young, he could observe what happened in people's expressions when they learned who his mother was, the calculations that would begin running immediately, the shift in how they regarded him, the replacement of whoever they had been seeing with aversion assembled entirely from assumptions about inherited wealth and privilege and a last name he had never used professionally. He did not want to be seen through that lens. He said explicitly and on multiple occasions that no good could come from the Vanderbilt association, and he meant it not bitterly, but practically as a conclusion drawn from evidence. He had watched what the name did to his mother. He had watched what the expectation of inherited ease did to the generations before her. He had seen up close what it meant to be defined by something you had not earned and could not control, and he had decided with the same quiet completeness that defined his journalism to step away from it entirely. The money question became for years a public statement as much as a private reality. Anderson said openly that his mother had made clear there would be no inheritance, no trust fund, no cushion of the kind that had supported and eventually hollowed out every generation before his. He called inherited money a curse directly and without performance in interviews that surprised people because he said it not with resentment but as a conclusion arrived at through observation. He asked in those same conversations who had ever received a significant inheritance and then gone on to build something genuinely meaningful with their own hands, and the Vanderbilt family itself was the answer he was pointing toward a century of people who had received fortunes and turned them into problems, who had confused the size of their houses with the significance of their lives, and who had arrived by 1973 at a family reunion where not one person in the room was a millionaire. Gloria had understood this too in her own way, and had chosen not to repeat the pattern with her sons. When Gloria Vanderbilt passed away in June 2019, at the age of 95, Anderson returned to CNN and spoke on air for several minutes about what she had been and what she had meant to him. He described her life with accuracy and with love: a child raised by a legal proceeding, a teenager pursued by cameras, a woman who had made and remade herself across 95 years with a creativity and a resilience that the Vanderbilt money had not given her and could not have bought. He said she was the coolest person he knew. He said she had been the last of his immediate family, the last person who had known him from the beginning. His father at 50, his brother at 23, his mother at 95. He said that they were all gone now and that he hoped they were at least together. The way he said it was not sentimental. Exactly, it was something quieter than that, the voice of a person who had spent 30 years learning to carry loss and had not quite finished learning. In the years that followed, Anderson began exploring his grief publicly in a way he had spent decades avoiding. He launched a podcast called All There Is about the experience of mourning and the slow, non-linear process of actually feeling loss, rather than simply surviving it and moving forward. He said that, in going through his mother's belongings after she passed, he realized he had spent most of his adult life doing exactly what he had done at 10 years old, in that hospital, pushing the feelings down, covering the hole, rather than looking into it. He said that grief has to go somewhere, that it cannot be kept sealed indefinitely, and that in sealing his, he had sealed alongside it much of his capacity for joy. The podcast reached millions of listeners because it turned out that what Anderson Cooper had inherited from the Vanderbilt family, the specific weight that had been passed through Gloria from the 10-year-old girl in the courtroom to the 21-year-old standing outside a hospital to the 40-year-old carrying his brother's absence every single day, was something that an enormous number of people recognized in their own lives, even without the railroad empire in the background. The Vanderbilt family downfall, as the standard history tells, it is a story about money. A fortune worth $3 billion in today's terms, that evaporated across 3 generations, mansions that became museums, a name that had once moved entire industries, now attached to exhibit placards and admission prices. That account is accurate, as far as it goes. But the story that Anderson Cooper lived is about something running beneath the money, something the fortune could not shield against and could not repair, a transmission of loss and displacement that started with a 10-year-old girl in a courtroom in 1934 and reached its last recipient on a July evening in 1988. The Vanderbilts built the greatest houses in American history and lost everything in the process. Anderson Cooper refused the house, refused the name, refused the inheritance, and built something that has endured by being entirely his own. In a family defined for a century by the question of what the money was, for he is the only one who found an answer that had nothing to do with money at all. The answer was work and grief, honestly carried, and the willingness to finally look into the hole instead of filling it with marble. That is not a small thing. That is, in its way, the most extraordinary thing that any Vanderbilt has ever done. If this story reached something in you, leave a comment below telling us what you think the real Vanderbilt legacy turns out to be, because the answer is not what most people standing in front of the mansions would expect. And if you want more stories about the families who built American empires and lost fortunes and left behind people who had to find their own way through, subscribe and stay with us. There is so much more to tell, and every story is worth your time.